Well, it's looking pretty close. Looking pretty close at the moment. The track's going to evolve, and of course, it's early days. Yeah, but Max Verstappen, quickest for Red Bull, but Lando Norris, sensational today in the McLaren. Really good with light fuel and on the longer runs as well. Of course, it's very difficult to compare like with like in terms of wing settings in Mexico, but it looks as if Red Bull are running more wing than their opposition. That's probably because they just want to be a little bit quicker on the straight, but thinking about time management in the race, and the more downforce they have, the better job they're going to do with that. So we'll see as the weekend evolves. But let's just have a look at the results of the soft tyre runs in FP2. When the track was at its quickest, there was a bit of worry in the pit lane about the possibility of rain. There's supposed to be a 20% chance of rain, and it does rain quite often in Mexico during this time of year, during the Grand Prix period. And it did rain indeed towards the end of the long runs at the end of FP2. There was also a change in wind conditions as the first part of FP2 progressed, a headwind developing in Sector 2, particularly head-on through the fast S's. Fernando Alonso particularly had a massive lose there in the Aston Martin 360, kept it all going thanks to a bit of runoff area. It wasn't kept on the tarmac, got to point that out. A difficult day for Fernando, got to say in brackets as well. Out late, and the Aston Martin not generating anything like the downforce we saw, efficient downforce we saw earlier in the year. But anyway, getting back to the times, Max Verstappen 18.6, Lando Norris 18.8, Charles Leclerc 18.9. Look at that, Valtteri Bottas and Daniel Ricciardo, two interlopers if you like, looking really good today in the Alfa Romeo. Valtteri 18.9, Sergio Perez 18.9, the crowd erupting whenever he came out onto the track. Daniel Ricciardo 19.0, Lewis Hamilton 19.0, and Esteban Ocon right there too, 19.0 in the Alpine. Very, very close, but the trends were whenever he was out, Max Verstappen always looking to be able to get out there and put the complete lap together. Sectors 1, 2 and 3 were very good. Quickest in a straight line that I saw all day was Nico Hülkenberg in the Haas Ferrari 351. Alex Albon 350 as well. Very quick in a straight line. Of course, it's a long straight in Mexico, thin through the air as well. Relatively small wings compared with some of the high downforce circuits. Although, as I say, Red Bull appear to be running more relative downforce than their nearest counterparts. So let's have a look at what happened in the long runs. Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, the two Ferraris, and Lewis Hamilton all ran on the medium tyre, the others on the hard tyre. We'll have more data as well from FP1 a bit further into this video. But Max, let's have a look at Max's run, because it's really the gold standard. We know how good he is, we know how good the car is, and we know how good Red Bull are at preparing for the weekend and potential problems that may occur. And 23.4, 23.7, 23.5, 23.4. And let's look at the top speeds he was doing there. Obviously with a full load of fuel, 314, 316, 316. So that is a top speed of a Red Bull with a full load of fuel. Now, before we go any further, we need to look at the top speeds of everyone else. Even Sergio Perez, considerably quicker average in a straight line, so probably running less fuel than Max. And no surprise there, Red Bull probably trying different setups with different fuel loads. Good use of the two drivers, and also on the hard tyre as well, of course. Lando Norris, look at his top speeds, 323, 317, 325, 34. At one point in a tow, I guess, it must have been in a tow, 350, 347, and then back in the 316, 317. And we saw this earlier in the day as well in FP1. Lando looking suspiciously quick in a straight line, and those lap times are correspondingly fast as well. Oscar Piastri ran the hard tyre. So got to say here, McLaren, with their recent results, coming to Mexico and doing basically what Red Bull do. Look at that, splitting the effort, medium and hard. Oscar Piastri on the hard tyre, putting in a lot of laps. They were out earlier than Max, starting their full tank runs, or their heavy fuel runs, let's put it that way, for FP2, which must have been a bit of a shock for Red Bull, because typically, historically, they're always the first team to be out there with fuel in the car. That's how organised they are. But here were McLaren gazumping them with that, and very impressive to see that. And Lando Norris, albeit, as we say, on the lighter fuel, looking really, really quick and consistent in the car. Oscar Piastri looking very fast as well. The Ferraris, 319, 315, 322, 328. Again, looks like they're not running the same fuel load as Max Verstappen. But if that's the case, not as quick as the McLarens around here. Very similar to Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes. I haven't got George Russell in there because he had to give his car to Frederick Vesti in FP1, so he wasn't quite up to speed in the second session. But Charles Leclerc, 23.8. Let's compare Charles with Lando Norris, bearing in mind their top speeds are pretty similar, indicating they're not running massively heavy fuel. 23.8, 23.2, 23.2, struggling to get into the 22s, and Lando comfortably in the 22s. So a little bit of an edge there for McLaren. So let's have a look at Lewis Hamilton now, also on the medium tyre, 22.6, 22.7. Looks good, but for him to be doing those top speeds, which are just about the same as McLaren, got to think that they may be running less fuel. Giving the benefit of the doubt with the thinner air, maybe the Mercedes is suffering less than it normally does if it doesn't have quite the same level of efficient downforce as, say, McLaren now, or Ferrari, maybe for that matter, on a circuit like this. Mercedes looking pretty good if that is the case. So 22.6, 22.7 for Lewis Hamilton. Not quite McLaren territory, but certainly there with the Ferraris, right up with the Ferraris. Carlos Sainz a little bit slower than Charles Leclerc, and Ferrari choosing to run both drivers on the medium tyre for their long runs. And I put Daniel Ricciardo in there as well, because he was not only quick on soft tyres, but Alfa Tauri getting him out there to do a long run as well with fuel in the car. First time that's happened for Alfa Tauri all year, probably. Others doing it as well. Valtteri Bottas got in a good long run, and the Haas Ferraris were out there too. And most of the teams, indeed, in Mexico, getting out there with fuel in the car towards the end, even though the rain was starting to fall. And I should just go back to the Lando Norris. Look at those last three laps, 23.5, 23.0, 23.3. He was doing those laps when the data screens were saying wet in sector 2, track greasy. George Russell saying the track's a bit too wet now to gain anything just by staying out. And there was Lando doing 23.5, 23.0, 23.3. A good indication of how drivable the McLaren is and of how confident Lando is as well. And I guess how much he's enjoying himself too. Anyway, going back to Daniel Ricciardo, on the hard tyre, so let's compare him with Sergio Perez and Oscar Piastri, 23.6, 23.7, 23.0. I mean, this is Oscar Piastri territory almost, and pretty similar in top speed as well. So a very, very good day for AlphaTauri, and the best day in Formula One yet since he won the Italian Grand Prix for McLaren, I would think, for Daniel Ricciardo. Really enjoying, obviously, being at this circuit in Mexico City. So very good day for Daniel Ricciardo. It's about this time of the year that the teams also begin fulfilling their commitments to the young driver program. That's always good to see. FP1 in Mexico, bit of a tradition now. Oliver Behrman, very impressive, I thought, in the Haas. Great car control, had a massive lose in the middle of the quick S's, just out there giving it everything he had, and was rewarded by being the quickest of the rookies. Doesn't actually mean very much, because virtually everybody else had issues of some sort or another. But here are the times. You can see Oliver Behrman in the Haas, 21.3, had a real ball out there, I think. Isaac Hadjar looked very good also in the AlphaTauri. Jack Doohan had some issues in the Alpine, but is very impressive. We know all about Jack and how good he is, and hopefully we'll see him racing in Formula One regularly in the not too distant future. And Frederick Vesti didn't get much of a run at all in the Mercedes. Well, he did. He got one run on the soft tyres, but never really looked as if Mercedes were giving him a free rein, and then he did a full tank run towards the end of the session. And Théo Pourchaire in the Alfa, probably a good thing. I'm sure they'll give him another go, but he basically didn't do a flying lap. He just had an issue from lap one, and that was that. So he was on the pit wall in civvies by the end of FP1. But as I say, it was so inconsequential for him that probably he will get another run in the car. For the regular front runners who were not giving their car away to the young drivers, there was meanwhile some interesting work to be done in FP1. Began with Pirelli, testing the Pirellis again, the new 2024 tyres for Pirelli. Not many conclusions could be drawn from that, apart from Max looking very good straight out of the box, as ever. And then they all went to a soft tyre run. You can see the results of that soft tyre run in the results of FP1. And then, interestingly, there were quite a lot of long runs towards the end of FP1 as well. And here you can see Max Verstappen was on the medium tyre, 23.7 fastest lap. Look at the consistency there, 23.7, 23.8, 23.8, 23.8, 27.9. And then the tyres either went off or he flat spotted them or did something and just stayed out there for the remainder of the session just to get the data in. But if you look at the top speeds there, 315, 317, 319, and in terms of FP1, about the same as the Ferraris and the Mercedes. So a conclusion to be drawn from FP1, albeit Max on the medium tyre, is that Red Bull's setup here is to be just about as quick as everybody else on the straight, hopefully just a little bit quicker, and then to use that extra downforce they've got with the wing to look after the tyres in terms of tyre management, extending the stints if they need to. 2 Ferraris on the hard tyres, as was Lewis Hamilton. Very, very similar between all 3. Actually, the quickest of the 3 was Carlos Sainz in terms of an individual lap, 22.7. Bear in mind, Carlos was not very well on Thursday, didn't come to the track for the normal media stuff, but was in the car today. Very good job. And good runs by both Ferrari drivers and very similar top speeds. Bearing in mind, normally you'd expect Mercedes to be slower than Ferrari. It's quite interesting that Lewis is doing 319, 317, 318, which is about on a par with the Ferraris. You could say maybe a tad slower, but not massively slower. And in terms of lap time, very similar as well. So that looks like, as the weekend pans out, certainly based on what we saw in FP1, it's going to be pretty close between Ferrari and Mercedes. No surprise there, really. And Lando Norris, meanwhile, a very good looking run as well on the hard tyre. But looking at the top speeds and looking at the overall pace of the car, maybe not running as much fuel as the others. But interesting runs nonetheless. And an intriguing radio conversation at the end of it with Charles Leclerc and his engineers. Good to see Jock Clear back in the Ferrari garage now, but this wasn't Jock that was talking to him. He said, Charles, you seem to be taking a big lift going into turn 12, which is the right-hander at the end of the long back straight, which was probably his way of saying you're braking earlier than Carlos there. And Charles got back on the radio and said, look, guys, I'm driving as hard as I can. I'm giving it everything. Basically, don't tell me how to drive the car, was the impression I got. And I think that's right. I've said before, the great drivers, the Max Verstappens, the Lewis Hamiltons, and I would include the Charles Leclercs there. And I haven't really had a good look yet at braking comparisons between Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. But I'd bet that Lando brakes later than Oscar. I'd be very surprised if it's the other way around. And here, this is a classic example. Carlos Sainz is always going to be a late breaker into that area there, whereas Charles Leclerc is always going to be thinking about stability, and he's going to be braking to a different point anyway, going into that right-hander into the stadium section. So it was, I don't know, if nothing else, it was a example of the disconnect, I think, sometimes between the way telemetry is read and data is read, the digital data, and what is actually going on with the right foot, the left foot, and the two hands, and the suppleness thereof. Anyway, I won't go into it in too much detail, but I thought that was an interesting little conversation. Right, to finish up on Friday, just a couple of did you knows that I've plucked out of my magazines and books here that I've now got stacked all over the place. That's great, just picking them out and looking at previous Mexican Grand Prix, reading through the reports and seeing what happened. These are 2 things that I'd either known and completely forgotten or never known in the first place, probably the first one, but anyway. 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. And I was looking through a really nice book I've got. It's about the 1.5 litre formula. And of course, that 65 Mexican Grand Prix was the last race. And there was a picture of them coming out of the hairpin. And it said, and you can just see the nose of the Lotus driven by Bob Bondurant. And I thought, wow, I wasn't aware Bob Bondurant ever drove any sort of Lotus, privately entered Lotus. So I did some research. And it turns out, and this is what I guess I've completely forgotten, was that apparently a road car driven by Innes Island, and he was driving to the track, and inside he had Richard Atwood, Bruce McLaren, and Jochen Rindt. This is on Friday morning to Mexico. They got completely lost in the Mexican City traffic and got to the circuit an hour and a half late and missed an hour and a half of practice, as you can imagine. And not good for Richard Atwood, Bruce McLaren, and Jochen Rindt. But Tim Parnell, who had his own Formula One team at that point, the son of Reg Parnell, who started that team, and he was running these private Lotus 25s, immediately sacked Innes Island for this massive error of getting lost and being late to the track. Just sacked him on the spot and put Bob Bondurant in the car. I never realised that. Anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. And imagine that happening today. And then the other one I was looking at, it was 1970. Mexican Grand Prix, which is the famous one when the track was invaded by the fans. I mean, there was a delay at the start and the drivers had to go out onto the circuit and plead with the fans to get back over the fence so they could start the race. Race eventually won by Jackie Ickx in the Ferrari. But on race morning, Joe Siffert got to his garage. He's driving a factory March. It's March 701, not a very nice car, but that was his car for the season before he joined BRM. And he'd left his track pack, his Leston track pack, the bag that they all had in those days with the helmet and the gloves and the overalls and the goggles. He'd left it in the garage. And when he got there, it had been stolen. Stolen in Mexico? Yeah, well, anyway, it had been stolen. So here he is. There he is in practice in the March 701 with his normal helmet. And here he is in the race wearing one of Emerson Fittipaldi's helmets. Now, I would conclude initially that that's because he went round and found the one that fitted him best and borrowed that from Emerson, obviously. But the real point, I was talking to Beaky Sims about this, who was on Emerson's car at that race. And don't forget, it was just 2 weeks after Emerson had won the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. Just this young kid from Brazil, amazing performance. And he said, Emerson by then was one of the few drivers that was totally into organisation and everything had to be laid out perfectly. And yes, he had a spare helmet, unlike most of the Grand Prix drivers of 1970 who didn't have a spare helmet with them at all. So Emerson was one of the few drivers that had the spare helmet and was able to lend his helmet, therefore, to Seppi Siffert to use in the race. Didn't last long. I think the engine blew or something after about 8 laps, but there he is. Amazing, eh? And then finally, I found this photograph, part of Peter Nygaard's great collection at Grand Prix Photo. And I never knew this took place either. This is just before the start of the 62 Mexican Grand Prix, which was a non-championship race then. The first championship Mexican race was in 63. But this was the scene before the start. And there's a minute's silence here. You can see all the drivers lined up, a minute's silence in memory of Ricardo Rodriguez, who lost his life the day before in that Rob Walker Lotus 24. Very rarely did you see things like that back in the 60s. All the drivers lined up like that, paying their respects to the memory of a driver. And Ricardo was a driver that just burst onto the Formula One scene, full of drama, full of reflexes, full of bravery. I mean, he was unbelievably quick, and it was just a sudden terrible thing in a Rob Walker. I mean, he's a Ferrari factory driver, but because Ferrari weren't at that race, he borrowed, I guess they paid Rob Walker to provide this Lotus 24. And the very, very sad thing is that car was then rebuilt. And the next race it did, it was driven by Gary Hocking, a great South African motorcyclist, and he was killed in the car as well. So in 2 races in the same car, 2 drivers were killed. But anyway, that was the scene with Ricardo Rodriguez, and then a great shock in Mexico, massive shock. And then Pedro came along and did his thing, and he was just as much of a class act. And then Pedro too sadly lost his life. So all very tragic, but all very much a part of the heritage of the Mexican Grand Prix. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow with a report on qualifying. Looking forward to that. Looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks to Pitbox.io. Thanks to Jetcraft. Take care.